Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I'm your host, Mike Allen. Well, more twists and turns in this story that you're about to hear than you can almost keep up with. In fact, just when you think you're at the end, you're going to find a whole new and unbelievable chapter opening up. You see, some ferocious creature was causing mayhem in the central Connecticut town of Glastonbury back in 1939. What was that creature? Well, my guest today is the single most knowledgeable person on the planet on this topic. His name is Mike Burdan. He's got a long-time association with the Glastonbury Historical Society, previously serving on its board and still managing their publications. And he's also authored numerous articles on the travel industry. Mike's going to be along in just a moment with this unbelievable story. You just won't believe it when you hear it. This week's trivia question: your town probably has a volunteer fire department. Which Connecticut town has the oldest continuously operating volunteer fire department in the country? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. When people need the best quality health care, there's a reason they turn to Yale New Haven Health. In 1826, Yale New Haven Hospital became Connecticut's very first hospital. They were the first hospital in the U.S. to use chemotherapy. Yale New Haven was the first to introduce insulin pumps for diabetic patients, and they introduced the world's first intensive care unit for newborns. For more information about Yale New Haven Health, visit ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. Normally, I'd be using this time to tee up the interview for the episode you're about to hear, but frankly, this interview has everything you need to know. You don't need to hear anything else from me. What I will tell you, though, because, I have to build up some suspense, is that back in 1939, that was 85 years ago, there was a mysterious and ferocious creature that terrorized the central Connecticut town of Glastonbury. Every time somebody thought, well, maybe this is a joke, something else would happen. And trust me when I tell you, just when you think this story is over, there's going to be an unbelievable twist at the very end. We're lucky to have with us today the undisputed expert on this matter, a man who's been associated with the Glastonbury Historical Society for many years, as a former board member and now as the person in charge of their publications. The story now of Glastonbury's ferocious creature with Mike Burdan. So, Mike, we know that something was terrorizing Glastonbury in 1939, and we're going to go through this story soup to nuts. And what I want to do to set the stage is kind of talk about Glastonbury itself. I mean, it's very rural in sections, and there's a lot of room for wildlife to sort of roam around. And because of the rural nature of Glastonbury, it is not foreign to having wildlife there, is it?
Oh, absolutely not. The eastern border along Manchester and the southern border along Marlborough is still heavily wooded, and it was even more heavily wooded back then. Very hilly. There were all kinds of creatures out there in the wild, and there have been and still are, I have seen them myself, bobcats in Glastonbury. Occasionally a lynx will materialize. So there was a very legitimate history of sightings, killings, and certainly hearings of wild cats throughout the early part of the 20th century, and it continued into the 1930s.
There is roughly a 2-week period in the winter of 1938 to 39, starting in December and going right through February, where some very bizarre happenings occurred. It started in late December. I love this story because Anne Kavanaugh, who's a Glastonbury resident, saw a cougar-like creature near her home, but nobody gave it any real attention. But a few weeks later, when Wells Strickland, one of the local deacons at the Buckingham Congregational Church, saw something, then it made some waves. Tell us that part of the story.
Anne Kavanaugh had seen, or thought she had seen, a mountain lion. or at least what she described as a mountain lion or cougar. All the other previous sightings had been bobcats. So she was the first one that actually pivoted and said, no, it wasn't a bobcat. It was something significantly larger. She thought it was a mountain lion. Did that put the idea in Deacon Strickland's mind? We don't know, but he certainly said that that's what he thought he said when he was out checking his woodlots in early January of 1939.
Now, there happened to be a stringer or a reporter for the Hartford Times who lived in Glastonbury, and he was the first one to report on this, right?
Yes, his name was Natalie Sestero. He eventually became managing editor of the Times. He was born and raised in South Glastonbury. He really knew the territory, and he supplied the first couple of stories for the Times. And as he would later be quoted years later in describing his take on it, he thought they were legitimate hard news stories. You know, he was hearing from people he knew about sightings and disappearing farm animals and mangled dogs, and he really believed that there was something out there. And so that set the tone for the Times's reporting from the very get-go.
Wells Strickland said that he had seen definitely something that was 2 feet tall, 3 feet long, and what people were saying was his 2-foot tail, which seems to set it off from everything else. And so this is now January 12th, 1939. The very next day, there are two sightings, a Mrs. Charles Bell and a Charles Ekstrom. What did they see? And especially Mrs. Charles Bell, she had a greyhound dog, and what happened to that dog?
Well, the dog was mangled, had some sort of very unpleasant encounter with a wild animal, presumably, and would never go back out into the woods. But Mr. Ekstrom had actually seen what he thought was the same critter that Deacon Strickland had seen a couple of weeks earlier. And he lived in the same part of town, so that idea probably would have been in the back of his mind. But he nonetheless claimed that he saw it as well.
By January 14th, just 2 days after the good deacon has seen what he saw, they organize the first hunt because they figure there's something worth going after. And they have the game warden for Hartford County, a guy named Charles Allshouse, gets involved here and organizes the hunt. And he has Ozark trained dogs. Tell us what he did.
First of all, he took this seriously. I mean, this was his job to protect the people of Glastonbury because he was the game warden. And he obviously believed that it was possible that there was some sort of escaped animal out there. He came to believe that it was a mountain lion that had escaped from a menagerie or a private zoo or something like that as a result of the hurricane of the previous September. The big hurricane, the Long Island Express, that blew through and did a whole bunch of damage throughout New England. And there were reports, nothing ever documented, that a mountain lion had been set free as a result. And he came to the conclusion that that's what it was out there.
So now we are, again, still in January as a reminder. They go out for this hunt, and they come back with a little bit of egg on their face, right? Because they're going after these tracks, and the tracks didn't turn out to be what they thought they were.
Oh, they came back with a lot of egg on their face. Yes, what they ended up following were the tracks of a domestic cat. And they followed it for the better part of 2 hours before they realized that, no, this was not any ferocious mountain lion or even a bobcat, just a tabby. This was not widely reported until later, and they never actually admitted that they had been fooled by a tabby. But it did set up this kind of mentality that now they really had to justify themselves, redeem their reputation as, intrepid Nimrods, and actually find something.
Within days after this first hunt on January 14th, on January 16th, another woman, Mrs. William Robinson, finds tracks with 2.5-inch wide tracks in the snow near her house. And so the very next day, there is this second hunt, and Allshouse, the game warden, takes out 16 hunters. What do we know about this second hunt?
Hall's house was convinced that there still was something out there, or at least he was of the opinion there was, and somewhat embarrassed that the first hunt had gotten sidetracked following a domestic kitty. So he had already decided, I should say, to have a second hunt. This sighting gave him kind of where he should go and the justification for doing so when he was able to find large tracks of that nature.
So now here we are. It's January 17th. He's going out on this hunt. And there's a photo that's captured in the paper showing the 16 hunters, but only two names are in the caption, Allshouse himself and a guy named James Lanieri. Now, tell us about Lanieri.
Okay, Lanieri is a very interesting individual and will be pivotal to the story later on. He was a very experienced and accomplished professional aviator. He had flown for a number of airlines, but most significantly in, I believe it was 1934, he had been recruited by Martin and Asa Johnson, who were kind of the Marlin Perkinses of their era, to go be their pilot on a big game hunt in Borneo. And for 14 months, he had piloted or captained, their airship around the area, taking pictures of wildlife, tracking it down, and engaging in several hunts. He was far and away the most experienced, knowledgeable, big game hunter that Glastonbury had to offer. And that's presumably why he was identified in that photo and would subsequently be quoted in the New York Times.
Just to wrap up this second hunt, so they go 10 to 12 miles. They don't even pick up the scent of any animal. So what did they find?
Well, they found nothing. They had two sessions. They covered areas where two sightings had taken place, but they did not find anything and came back once again embarrassed and empty-handed.
So now Allshouse is still not done with this. He thinks there's going to be a third hunt. We'll get to that in a second. But now the media steps in and starts putting their imprint on this. And whereas there had been some sort of serious reporting, now we start to get some tongue-in-cheek reporting. And it's the Hartford Courant on, I guess, January 18th, 1939, that comes out with this headline, Guffaws of Glastonbury Glawackus Greet Gloomy Gang of Gunners.
Well, the Courant was the second paper to the story because Nat Sestero was a resident of South Glastonbury, and he took what I call the hard news high road in his initial reporting. The Courant seems to have felt that it had to take a different route, and using its stringer, Pelton Ferry, also a Glastonbury resident, it took the more whimsical, entertaining low road. Pelton Ferry, important to note, was presumably only paid when a story was published, and he was paid by the column inch. So he had every incentive to write at will, kind of make things up, just keep the story going as often as he could. But both papers would kind of zigzag, cross paths. Whenever something happened that really did have to be reported of a serious nature, they would both do that. But by and large, you could say the Times took a very serious view of it, but the Courant took the very whimsical view of it.
This term Glawackus comes out. Explain what that was supposed to mean.
That title was manufactured by editor Frank King, and the term Glawackus, and he made it out of whole cloth, but very creative whole cloth. The partitives were Glastonbury, Gla, wacky, because that's what the whole town had become over this. And then he added a little Latinate suffix to make it sound legitimate.
Something that same day happened that kind of shook people, because here they're thinking, well, tongue-in-cheek, this is pretty funny. But then Christopher Bagata reports what happened to his dog, a beagle, out in the woods. And what do we know about that?
The reporting on that, his beagle had gone out in the woods and had a ferocious, and in this case, fatal encounter with some wild creature, had limped home, somehow got himself back to the family woodshed, and expired there on the spot. After the second hunt, Allshouse had said he would only go have a third hunt, not until he had definitive proof that something was out there, and it was the alleged demise of the Bagota dog at the hands or paws of the Glawackus that convinced him that he needed to have a third hunt.
Now, there's also the next day, January 19th, George Hutchinson, who lived in town, and he had a 3-day-old goat in a shed behind his house. What happened to that?
Well, the goat just disappeared, and no one knows what happened to the goat. There weren't, however, any of the telltale traces that a cat had killed it. There didn't seem to be any blood. There was no carcass that had been dragged clearly through bushes. That was just one of the still unexplained mysteries of the Glawackus episode.
Now, I just want to remind the listeners, we're still in the first week of activity from when the good deacon first saw what he thought was a catamount on January 12th. We're now at January 19th, 7 days later, when all this is happening. And this third hunt now is scheduled for January 21st. And right at the 11th hour, it gets canceled because there's a dispute between the dog warden and a policeman. What was this about?
Okay, well, actually, Allshouse had been kind of relieved of duty by his superior at this point, a state game warden, John Smith, which gives you an idea how seriously the authorities were taking all this. What had happened was there was a dispute between the dog warden of Glastonbury, a gentleman by the name of Leroy Simmons, and policeman Willard Cornish as to what had actually killed the Bogota dog. Neither had apparently seen the dog, but were relying upon what the Bogota family had told them. So Game Warden Smith decides, we've got to exhume the dog and see what actually killed it. See if we can't get some sort of idea about what we're looking for out there. Well, lo and behold, they did, and found out that the dog had not been mauled by any wild creature, but had been shot in the muzzle with a .22. On the basis of that, and presumably he got Mr. Bogota to explain, all right, what did happen to your dog, they canceled that third hunt.
So now, the word, of course, did not get out to everybody in town that this third hunt had been canceled, and about 200 amateur hunters had decided that they were going to participate that day, and off they went anyway. Now, none of them found anything except for one guy, a Hartford hunter, who actually took a shot at things. And tell us about this gentleman and what happened to him.
Yes, presumably what happened was that all these amateur hunters, the ones who were not included in the professional hunt, concluded they could do a better job than the professionals who had found nothing, or alternatively had followed a cat the first time. So they just basically go at will, unorganized, throughout the woods of Glastonbury on the day of the canceled official hunt to see if they can find anything. And as you said, only one individual. He was accompanied by the three Bogey brothers of Glastonbury. So it was not just one person who saw this. But what he did see was a very large, very dark, long-tailed cat, which he described as a panther. He actually got a shot off at it, but of course missed, and then the second barrel of his double-barrel shotgun jammed. The critter scurried off into the woods in what he would describe as 12-foot strides. So you now have 4 people having seen the animal again, and one actually getting a shot off at it.
The next day, January 22nd, the New York Times puts this story in their national edition. And they go back to this guy, Lanieri, who is, this great hunter and with all this experience. And he's quoted in there as saying that he had gone, I guess, on a separate hunt near his brother's house. And he had an opinion about what he had seen based on some tracks, right?
Well, the New York Times was one of the organizations that didn't get the call that the hunt had been canceled in time. They already had a stringer and an AP photographer on site in Glastonbury, and since they were already there that morning, the Times was going to use them. So the writer who could not write about the hunt, which wasn't taking place, instead went back and did what we'd call a deep background story on the history of the Glawackus, presumably for the Times' national readership, which didn't know anything about it. One of the more salient features of that was his interview with Lanieri, again, by virtue of his experience in Borneo, and reputedly, the most knowledgeable and authoritative spokesman on hunting in the state of Connecticut, was convinced that they were on the trail of a mountain lion. And he goes on record as saying that's what he thought it was. They were going to apparently persist until they actually found this critter.
So now Linares on the record saying all this, and we could get into more and more detail, but we're going to skip over the fact that over the next couple of weeks there are more and more sightings, and they're as far away as Canterbury and Scotland, Connecticut, and Portland, other places. And of course, there's a lot of wildlife out there, but everybody's heightened now, and the sensitivity is through the roof. But on March 1st, still in the winter, it's reported that the day before, I guess the end of February, a hunter named Milton Strong had bagged an animal. And tell us about that.
Milton Strong had finally done what no one else had been able to. He had actually killed an animal, and it very much answered to the general description of the Glawackus. It was about 4 feet long. It was a 27-pound brown lynx, brown being significant because most of the description had the animal being much darker than a normal bobcat. Not only did he kill it, he brought it and put it on public display, first in East Haddam and then at a gas station in East Hartford. So plenty of people were able to go over and see this animal. The Times certainly sent a reporter over there, as did the East Hartford Weekly Gazette. They gave detailed descriptions, but unfortunately, neither of them published a photo.
So now this is what we would generally say, okay, that's wrap up of the story. Thank you very much, Mike, and we enjoyed this. It was great fun. However, this is not the end of the story by any stretch of the imagination, and thanks to you, I take my cap off to you for some work you did, because you found there was an article done by the Glastonbury Life in 2012, and it had a reader's quiz, and a 73-year-old woman from Bronxville, New York, Shirley Williams Holmes, sent a response to this, and this opened an entirely new chapter. Tell us about this.
On the 50th anniversary of the Glawackus, a Times writer had published a very humorous piece, taking the tack that there was never anything out there to the Glawackus, and it was accompanied by their graphic artist Phil Lohman's extremely humorous depiction of what looked like a hunchback grinning tabby with 6 drops of blood falling from its tongue. This became the popular image of the Glawackus and was the one that was being circulated around the town of Glastonbury. This was the image that had appeared in a history book about Glastonbury and that had appeared in Glastonbury Life and had prompted the quiz, kind of what do you know about the Glawackus? Well, Shirley Williams Holmes happened to know a good deal, and not firsthand knowledge, but very reputable secondhand knowledge, because she claimed and was able to prove with tangible evidence that part of the Glawackus story was that her father, James Rufus Williams, an aviator, a friend of Jim Linares, and a very accomplished practical joker, had decided to fool the Glastonbury hunting fraternity, and especially Jim Linares, by going out in the woods with manufactured footprints out of wood that he had made the basement of his house to try to fool the hunting fraternity, and especially Jim Linares.
So this is incredible when you stop to think about it, and unfortunately, by the time you come up on this information in the archives and try to reach out to her, she has deceased, but you found her brother.
Yes, her younger brother, Stoddard, Reverend Stoddard Williams, was still very much alive, and I and a colleague of mine went over to their house in Simsbury. Lo and behold, he had the second of the 2 wooden prints. Shirley had the first, and there was a picture of it in that Glastonbury Life article in 2012. He had the second, and he very kindly donated it to the Historical Society, and we still have it. Unfortunately, Reverend Stoddard has passed away, but we got the story, got it confirmed from him. He shed some more light on it, but he certainly confirmed what his sister had said. They both have some of the details wrong, and that is primarily because their source was not their father, who ended up dying in December of 1939, but their mother, relaying what her husband had told them years later. So there would naturally be some slight discrepancies and some small contradictions, but the fact that they both had the two prints that James Williams had used to fool the hunting fraternity certainly suggests that they were on the proverbial right track.
So he gets these two fake paw prints, wraps them around his shoes, goes in with his truck and stops and walks through some woods, making these paw prints, takes off the paw prints from his shoes when he gets to a road so they can't trace it back, circles back around to his truck. And why did he do this?
It's his daughter's story that he drove and did it at a certain place. No one knows for sure where that was, but it seems to have been on the grounds of Woodland Road in Glastonbury, because as it turned out, that home was owned by Jim Laneri's brother, Chester. So it was surmised, or at least I surmised, that he put the prints there on probably the evening of January 15th, so that Jim Laneri would find out about it through his brother, and he would take a hunting party over there and inspect those prints and try to bag the lion that was allegedly making them.
And he actually did do that, and that's when he gave the quote saying, "I think we're going after a mountain lion." So then Williams, who's put these fake prints in there, does another set of prints. It takes Laneri to a campfire. Tell us about that.
What he was waiting for, and I'm not sure he knew exactly when he would know that his practical joke was complete, but it certainly was when Laneri was quoted in the New York Times as saying it was a mountain lion, and he was on the tracks of it. So a couple of days later, a week later, we don't know, according to his son, Reverend Stoddard Williams, who heard it from his mother, Williams goes out and lays another set of tracks, but this one doesn't just disappear onto a road, but he has them lead up to a little campfire, which he has set up there in the woods. He, Williams, is waiting there with a case of what I call conciliatory beer, waiting for Laneri and his hunters to show up. And they do, and I hope they all had a good laugh about it. I'm not sure that Laneri took it quite as lightly as the other hunters did, but that appears to have been the end of Jimmy Williams's role in the Glawackus. There were other sightings afterwards, and they would continue until Milton Strong bagged that brown lynx at the end of February.
And it's the understanding that Williams pulled this prank on his friend Laneri because he thought maybe he was getting too swollen of a head with all this coverage about him being a big game hunter.
Yes, Laneri had really been boasting about his prowess as a big game hunter, showing off some of the trophies he had brought back from Borneo. And of course, he'd gotten a lot of publicity locally. And that's why the New York Times quoted him in their story. And so this all seemed to be a setup to bring Laneri down a couple of pegs, and it apparently succeeded.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. The Glawackus, incidentally, lives on. If you check the website for the Hartford Athletic Soccer Team, you'll find that their mascot is a creature named Dylan. Says the team on its website, quote, "Dylan is our club's wacky, fluffy, and friendly take on the Glawackus." I want to thank our guest for today's program, Mike Burdan. He's former board member of the Glastonbury Historical Society and currently manages their publications. The answer to this week's trivia question: which Connecticut town has the oldest continuously operating volunteer fire department in the nation? Well, the answer is the Wethersfield Volunteer Fire Department, chartered back in 1803, but with a local firefighting history that actually dates back centuries before that. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, learn the fascinating story of how fires were both detected and fought in the olden days when wood was king. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.